Last session we considered the life of the morning star of the Reformation, the trailblazing, incredibly intelligent theologian, translator, church reformer, John Wycliffe. Wycliffe, the man whose body was exhumed after his death and burnt for being a heretic by order of the Pope, would have his writings, Bible translation, and basically anything associated with him and his followers, the Lollards, stamped out throughout England and Europe. The church did everything in its power to kill and end the ideas of Wycliffe. But here is the problem. You can kill a man, you can kill many men and women, you can burn books, you can even burn corpses, but you can't kill an idea. Ideas are bulletproof. And so it was that the ideas of Wycliffe found themselves in the hands of the most unlikely of people imaginable. A man living nearly 900 miles away in the kingdom of Bohemia, a part of the Holy Roman Empire in the lands now known as the Czech Republic. And there, the ideas of Wycliffe would lead to rebellion, insurrection, revolution, and even the calling of holy wars, of multiple crusades. It's a story that involves a protest for the truth of the gospel and against the corruption of the church. A story that involves defenestration multiple times. We'll find out more about that awesome word later. And it involves a legendary general who, even after he became completely blind, never lost a battle. And our chief protagonist is a man by the name of Jan Hus. Jan Hus, from the Bohemian town of Hussites. He was from a poor family, born about 1372, 12 years before Wycliffe died. And Hus moved to Prague to make a living serving and singing in churches, before eventually studying at university and being ordained. Now, Hus was not a man of immense natural intelligence like Wycliffe. He was never going to break new ground or promote a novel theory he came up with, but he was an incredibly hard worker, someone who put 110% into all of their studies, indeed in everything that they did. And so it was that at university he came across the writings of an English theologian named Wycliffe, whose Latin works he devoured. In Wycliffe, Hus found a new perspective. He adopted Wycliffe's philosophical leanings and his religious teachings. By 1398 he was teaching at the university. He was Dean of Philosophy in 1401 and University Rector in 1402. Following the path of Wycliffe, whose works he began to translate into Czech, Hus railed against the corruption of the church, its ties to the state, the rampant simony or buying of church offices, the practice of indulgences and pilgrimages and relics, the scandalous worldliness and sinfulness of bishops and clergy and monks and friars. And like Wycliffe, in England, Hus's zeal for reform led to many supporters among the masses and indeed among some of the key secular power players in the kingdom. Hus even read word for word documents from Wycliffe's Oxford University days from the pulpit of the university church. But sticking true to ideals is hard, and Hus was far from perfect. In 1408, the Pope told the Archbishop that Wycliffe was a heretic, and anything to do with him must be stamped out. On order of the King of Bohemia, the order came for all Wycliffe's writings to be given over to the state, and Hus obeyed. But his reforming zeal could not be kept quiet for long, as the state of the church turned into a farce. This was the time of the Western Schism we spoke about a few sessions ago, when there was a pope in Rome and a pope in Avignon, both claiming to be the real pope. And this schism put the King of Bohemia in a difficult spot. He wanted to be the next Holy Roman Emperor over all the kingdoms of that empire. But the Pope in Rome didn't like him. So, the king declared official neutrality for his kingdom of Bohemia, but denounced the claims of the Pope in Rome, which he was being asked to support. However, the Archbishop stayed loyal to the Roman Pope, as did most of the university. Only one group in the university stayed loyal to the king's orders against the Pope of Rome. And as you might expect, it was the group led by Jan Hus, who was deeply influenced by Wycliffe's own pro-monarchy, anti-papacy writings about where God placed true authority in a nation. To make things worse, in 1409 the Western Church Council elected a third pope while denouncing the two already existing. Now you had a pope in Rome, a pope in Avignon, and a new pope in Pisa. Hus and the king declared allegiance to this new pope in Pisa. But this pope cracked down even harder on the so-called Wycliffites in Bohemia, even going so far as to ban the free preaching of the gospel outside of church structures. Hus was excommunicated, but not silenced, and the breaking point for him would come only a few years later. The Pope of Pisa called for a crusade, a holy war, against the kingdom of Naples in southern Italy, which was protecting the Pope of Rome. That's right, the church had got to the point of popes calling holy wars against other popes. And to try and fund it, the Pope of Pisa ordered the selling of indulgences, where you paid money to get time off purgatory. Hus was incensed by the blatant money grab in the name of religion, the false peddling of hope and salvation for cash. He disputed the practice in the university, in which Huss's speeches were basically just him reading Wycliffe's own works. As I said, Hus was not really an original thinker. Holy war to Hus and Wycliffe was a nonsense. Christians are to turn swords into plowshares and forgive our enemies, not raise armies against them funded by a false gospel. The furore and protests around this led to 3 men who called indulgences nothing but fraud to be beheaded, the first martyrs of the Hussite church. The king stepped in, trying to stop Hus's teaching, but Hus and his followers would not be stopped. They said that they would only stop their teaching if it could be proved unscriptural and not the teaching of the Bible. On October the 18th, 1412, Jan Hus left Prague for the countryside to continue his preaching and spread his movement. Before leaving, he publicly proclaimed something which would mark the start of the Bohemian Reformation. He said, publicly, that in all matters in which he was accused of false teaching, he appealed directly to Jesus Christ, and thus the structures and laws of the land and the church were irrelevant. In the countryside, as Wycliffe had done, he wrote many tracts and pamphlets to educate the masses on the teaching of the Bible and true religion. Huss's other major theological works would really just be rehashes or even complete abstracts of Wycliffe's own books, but in Czech. When the Council of Constance was called in 1414 by the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, who was the brother of the King of Bohemia, Hus was invited to attend to try and put to bed the dissent and protesting that was rocking the Holy Roman Empire. For of course the ideas of Hus hardly stayed in the national boundaries of Bohemia. They'd spread to Hungary and Poland and Austria. Hus made his will before he left, having the foresight to know what would actually happen if he went. Despite the promises of protection by the Holy Roman Emperor, Hus was imprisoned, put on trial and condemned on the 6th of July 1415, aged only in his mid-40s. Then he was burnt alive. Before he died, he spoke the faithful prophecy which Martin Luther would see himself as fulfilling. Hus prophesied, "You may kill a weak goose." Hus means goose in Czech. but more powerful birds, eagles, falcons, will come after me. The martyrdom of Hus ignited the Hussite wars back in Bohemia. In 1419, during a church march through the streets of Prague, a stone was thrown from the town hall and it struck the Hussite priest who was leading it. The mob was enraged and stormed the town hall. They took hold of the judge, the burgomaster and 5 members of the town council and threw them out of the higher windows, where gravity and the ground combined to kill them. Now, lots of languages have very specific words for particular things. Unusual words. For example, in Japanese there's a specific word for death through overwork. And there's a particular word for the way light streams through the leaves of trees. In English, we have a specific word to describe the act of throwing people to their death from a high window. We call it defenestration. Defenestration. And so, in 1419, the first, because there would be 3, with the third one actually leading to the 30 Years' War, the first defenestration of Prague took place. When news of the defenestration reached the King of Bohemia, he was so shocked that he died. The death of the king led to uprising. Those who were not Hussites but supporters of Rome were expelled from cities and the land. And this, as is often the case in these conflicts, followed largely ethnic lines. The native Czechs being almost all Hussites, and the local Germans being Roman Catholic. The most zealous and almost puritanical of the Hussites were centred around the city of Tabor, and among of them was elected a genius military commander named Jan Žižka. Jan Žižka. Žižka would bring new tactics to the largely peasant uprising. His armies lacked a lot of armour and weapons, but what they had was wagons, farming tools, and a willingness to try and use the latest technology. Gunpowder. Something that required very little training. You just point and shoot, and even the most heavily armoured noble knight could die. Žižka would have his armies carried around in wagons, and then when battle came, chain the wagons together into squares, so that cavalry could not charge those in the wagons or behind the wagons. And inside the middle of this wagon square there would be Hufnitzer, from which we get the word howitzer. So short, squat cannons which launched projectiles on a high trajectory over the wagons and back down onto the enemy. Along with this, there were soldiers, civilians really, armed with early guns called piszczala, from which we get the word pistol. And they would shoot the enemy, and therefore make the enemy have to assault these wagons. The enemy had to attack because of the artillery and the pistols, but many would die on the approach. And then they'd be forced back with spears and bills and halberds at the wagons, and then face a devastating countercharge from within the wagons. Žižka saw such success with this tactic against vastly superior and larger armies that he created a standard template for the wagons and had them mass-produced, almost like we would do with tanks today. As his armies became better trained and equipped, he even had the wagon forts move around during the battlefield like mobile castles. Žižka was so successful against the Royalists and Roman Catholic armies in Bohemia that in 1420 a crusade was called against the Wycliffites, the Hussites and all other heretics of Bohemia. Crusaders from all over Europe joined and laid siege to Prague, but they were unsuccessful and negotiations began. The Hussites formulated the 4 Articles of Prague to put across their demands. And in brief, these 4 articles were: number 1, the word of God is to be preached freely in Bohemia in an orderly manner by priests. Number 2, this is very important, Holy Communion shall be given in both bread and wine. Number 3, the secular power and riches of the church are to be removed and clergy are to live simple evangelical lives. And number 4, mortal sins and actions against God's law done by people in any and every rank of society and church are to be punished. These seem to us like fairly obvious, simple and non-controversial demands, but they were soundly rejected, especially the idea of communion with both bread and wine given to everyone, instead of everyone getting bread and only the priest getting the bread and the wine. And so the crusade restarted and utterly failed. After many defeats, all of the Bohemia fell to the Hussites. A new crusade was called and arrived in 1421, but again the legend that was General Žižka defeated them. For a time, outside intervention ended, but internal strife between different factions within the Hussite movement, for both theological and personal political reasons, led to internal conflict and fighting. Žižka would give the radical reforming group from Tabor the victory for a time, just before the Pope called a third crusade, but that one never really came to anything. Žižka, who lost one eye and then another, making him completely blind, he defeated at this point 3 crusades, and all other internal enemies within the kingdom of Bohemia for his radical Hussites. And he never lost a battle, even when he was completely blind. But he would finally die of plague in 1424, and his dying wish, and this is so legendary and epic, his dying wish was that he would be skinned and his skin used to make drums so that he could still lead his armies in death. What a legend. His successor was Prokop the Great, and he would defeat the 4th anti-Hussite crusade, which arrived in 1427, and again he would defeat the 5th anti-Hussite crusade in 1431, and this was the final ever crusade called by the popes and marks the very final end of the era of crusades, which we started looking at way back in session 42, 11 sessions ago. The internal conflict between the moderate and radical Hussite groups would finally end when Prokop the Great and his radicals were defeated by the moderates. With calmer heads, the moderates managed to get the Pope in Rome to agree, in essence, to those 4 articles of Prague, and essentially have the Church of Bohemia be, in name, Roman Catholic, and in theory, under the Pope, but practicing a very different kind of Christianity to the rest of Europe, one which would give communion to everyone in bread and wine. The radical faction who were defeated would later go on to become the foundation of what we know as the Moravian Church, whilst the moderate Hussites would go on to adopt the teaching of Martin Luther when the Reformation broke out less than 100 years later. In 1567, Bohemia would officially break away from Rome once more and gladly take the name Protestant, as others had across Europe. Even more so than with Wycliffe, the Hussites had many aspects of later Protestant theology in place long before the Reformation. But what marked them out as different and not really in line with Luther and Calvin and Cranmer and the Reformation proper was that they didn't emphasise and centre the doctrine of salvation and justification through faith alone as the very heart of what they were about. In this, they were so close, and yet so far. To truly rediscover the gospel, and the gospel truth would require access to the original Greek and Hebrew Bible, fresh translations of the original languages of the Bible, not the rather poor, problematic translation into Latin by Jerome. And that is where a Roman Catholic scholar named Desiderius Erasmus comes in. But more on him next time.